All right, so today I have a little presentation for you on high blood pressure, also known as hypertension. My name's Haley, and I am a dietetic intern doing my community rotation through Meals on Wheels. So before I get into the nitty-gritty details of high blood pressure, I want to talk a little bit about Meals on Wheels. This will just be very brief. So Meals on Wheels is basically a meal delivery that comes every weekday between around 11 and 1:30 p.m. So this meal delivery consists of one hot meal and one cold meal per day, and they come together at the same time. Each day it's something different. They have a little menu online. You can see what it is. And each meal is low in sodium, fat, and concentrated sugars so that they are good for people with so many various conditions, including high blood pressure. And because these are just delivered on weekdays, they also have frozen meals available that can be delivered to be eaten over the weekend. And you don't have to get them delivered every day. They are, they just require you to have a minimum of 2 days of meal delivery per week. And if you want to apply, you can visit the website, mealsonwheelsmd.org. And they ask you to supply your income, as they do have a sliding scale of meal prices, and that helps them decide where on that sliding scale you'll fit for how much you would pay. And each meal has different special options for different needs. So you can get them specifically with no pork, no fish, texture modified, and kosher meals. And Meals on Wheels also offers other helpful services. So they have grocery shopping, where a volunteer goes and takes your grocery list and goes to the store, buys all the groceries you need, and then comes back, can help you put them away. They have phone pals, which is basically a weekly phone call with a volunteer at a specified time, and it's about half an hour to just have somebody to talk to, go over your day, your week. And nutrition education. So if you are diagnosed with a new condition, or you just want to know more about nutrition, Meals on Wheels can help you get that resource. And there are also some other helpful services, such as if you have a pet, they have something called Kibble Connection, which um, they have donations of pet food that they can help deliver to your house, just like they would with the groceries. However, since they're donated, this is at no cost. Um, and there are a couple other things as well. So now we're going to get into the blood pressure, and I'm just going to start off by kind of explaining what blood pressure itself is before talking about high blood pressure and hypertension. So blood pressure is the amount of force pressing against your blood vessels. So if your blood vessel is like this, like a tube, the blood is flowing through it. So as the blood flows through, it's going to be pressing against the walls of that blood vessel. So it's measured in mmHg, which is millimeters of mercury. And when it's measured, there are two numbers. So the upper number is systolic blood pressure, which is the pressure during the heartbeat. So it's as the heart is pumping out that blood. So that's also during what is called the systole. And that number is going to be higher because the blood is pushed harder. So if it's being pushed harder, the force against the blood vessel is going to be greater. And the lower number is the diastolic blood pressure, which is during the rest between beats. So that one's going to be lower. And that rest between beats is also called the diastole. So then we get into high blood pressure. So high blood pressure is also called hypertension, which you can get into, like hyper is high and tension. If you think about tension, it's like high pressure. So the standard measure is when the upper number is 130 or higher for high blood pressure, or when the lower number is 80 milligrams of mercury or higher. So the important thing to note about this is that these are chronic measures. So if you go to the doctor once and the upper number is 135, if your blood pressure is like 135 over 72 or something, that wouldn't necessarily be diagnosed as high blood pressure because there are so many various reasons that that number might be higher. We A lot of people have heard of white coat syndrome, which I think it's syndrome, which is just the nerves of being at the doctor kind of make that number higher. Uh, Whereas in your day-to-day life, that number wouldn't be quite as high. So next I have this chart from the American Heart Association, um, which goes through different blood pressure categories. And you'll see that middle column says and or. So when you get to the high blood pressure, it says or, because only one of those needs to be in that range for it to be considered that. Um, and you see, I talked about 130 over 80, whereas this says normal is less than 120. That's just because elevated isn't necessarily considered hypertension, but it is something that would maybe be cause to change some habits. So we see there are different stages of hypertension, and then hypertensive crisis, which is when your blood pressure is extremely high. And that's just, you would want to immediately consult your doctor, as this can lead to more detrimental health problems, such as a heart attack. So this is why if you have high blood pressure, it's kind of important to be able to monitor it yourself. So talking about why high blood pressure matters, you might say, okay, why does it really matter that my blood pressure is high? Like, why is that a problem? So if your blood pressure is high, your heart has to work harder to pump blood. So if you think about like water versus something thicker, like honey, it takes a lot more to pour honey than to pour water. So your heart has to work harder to pump the blood. And it can damage the blood vessels as it pushes through, because it's pushing so much harder against their walls that it can damage the blood vessels as it's going. And through damaging these blood vessels, that can prevent blood flow to important organs. And some people might not even know that they have high blood pressure, and it can lead to other health issues, like I talked about before. It can lead to heart disease. So it's just really important to, if you are aware that you have high blood pressure, make some changes. And if you aren't aware, you can still lead a healthy life through making these changes, because these are changes that just constitute a healthy diet. So the American Heart Association suggests 5 steps for people with high blood pressure. So one is to know your numbers, which just means, like, if you're at the doctor, know what your blood pressure was when it was measured. The next is to work with your doctor to make a plan. And this might mean working with a treatment team. It might mean working with a couple people. You might want to see a dietitian to learn more about how you might want to change your diet. But you want to work with your doctor to make a plan for how to check your blood pressure, take medication, make lifestyle changes. So that goes into the next 2, to check your blood pressure at home. There are so many different ways, different like versions of blood pressure cuffs to check your blood pressure at home. And that's, again, just to see if it's being elevated or like we talked about, hypertensive crisis. And then take your medication if you've been prescribed one. Not everybody will be prescribed a medication, but it's very important to take them as prescribed if you are prescribed them. Because if you aren't taking them on the proper schedule, they wouldn't work as well. And if you just don't take them at all and you're trying to just make the lifestyle changes, there's a reason that your doctor suggested the medication and prescribed it to you. And then finally, lifestyle changes. So I'll go on to the next slide for that. So there are a couple different methods that people use for people with hypertension. So the first is the DASH diet, and DASH stands for Dietary Approaches to Stop Hypertension. And this one doesn't specifically focus on sodium Rather, it focuses on what you should be eating rather than cutting out. So naturally, with the foods you'll be eating, it's low in saturated fat, total fat, and cholesterol, which those can increase your blood pressure just due to the fatty content of them. And the reason it's low in these is because it's so high in fruits, vegetables, low-fat dairy, and also whole grains. So these are just naturally lower fat options that lead to the whole diet being lower in them. And then there's also just try and stick to under 1,500 milligrams of sodium per day and knowing some sneaky sources of it. So if you don't know, sodium can be found in a lot of different things you might not expect. So it's not just table salt. And some sources of it can be canned foods. So a lot of times canned foods have a lot of sodium in them just because they're being preserved. And there are lots of options where you can buy a low sodium version of the canned food. And there are some other times where you can't find that. But if you can only find the regular version of something like beans, something you can do is rinse that out. So if you have a colander, just dump the beans in the colander, rinse them out, it'll get the sodium off. Another sneaky source of sodium is frozen meals, which again, because they're being preserved and frozen, they tend to have some more sodium. And not all frozen meals have a lot of sodium in them, but they do tend to be a little higher in sodium. And another one is lunch meat. Lunch meats are very high in sodium. So they're just something that you want to just consume in moderation. And being under this 1,500 milligram mark is something that can help a lot. And that's sodium can be found on a nutrition label. It'll tell you how many milligrams of sodium are in a serving of a food. I should have a bar here. So, for instance, this granola bar I have right here says it has 170 milligrams of sodium. I don't know if it's sodium. And that's just something that can be noted, or just be mindful of the kind of sodium you're eating, the amount. So you don't necessarily have to add it all up, but just be mindful of the choices you're making. And even if you aren't trying to do the DASH diet, you can focus your diet on those fruits, vegetables, whole grain, poultry, and fish. And the reason we say poultry and fish is those tend to be a little bit leaner and lower in fat than other options like red meat. And then finally, find exercise you enjoy. So I would never tell somebody who hates walking to go out and walk every day. But there are so many different forms of exercise. And I think a lot of times it's just a matter of finding the one that you like. And exercising can help lower that blood pressure. Immediately after exercise, due to the stress, that blood pressure might be higher, but it'll bring your like baseline blood pressure down. So here's some tips for cooking meals to make sure that they are appropriate for high blood pressure. So like I said, reduce consumption of red meat or choose a leaner cut. So I know if you are very used to eating red meat, you might not want to cut it out entirely, which is understandable. But you can choose a leaner cut instead. So if you're eating red meat a couple times a week, maybe one of those days you change it for something else, but the other days you might try to choose a leaner cut just to reduce that fat in your diet. A lot of fat from meat is saturated fat, which isn't necessarily something we want to entirely cut out, but it is something that we want to limit. And then again, aim to buy foods lower in saturated and trans fats. So trans fats are ones that we want to completely avoid if we can. Sometimes it's not possible, but those are in a lot of processed foods. And then saturated fat, those are in processed foods and also in meats. And then just check the sodium content. Like I said, look for the nutrition label, and opt for foods marked low sodium, or rinse canned foods to reduce sodium. So if it's something that you don't necessarily need the liquid for, like I said, the beans. Sometimes if you're using something like canned tomatoes, you want to keep that juice in there. So kind of just look for the can that says low sodium if something you don't want to necessarily rinse off. And finally, use salt-free seasonings to add flavor without sodium. So it's really simple and easy to just get a seasoning blend or just plain herbs or spices that don't contain sodium. I know there are several different no sodium blends out there that are specifically made for people who can't have sodium or want to reduce their intake of sodium. So that's just like a great way to improve the flavor without adding salt. Because I know a lot of times if we're cooking more salt, we're doing it for the flavor. So I'm going back to how Meals on Wheels helps. So all the meals from Meals on Wheels are low in sodium. So that's not something that you have to worry about. Um, you don't have to worry about trying to find a nutrition label. And we also do offer that nutrition education and can help connect you with other services in your area that might be beneficial. So now I'm going to move on to a chicken and asparagus tossed with penne recipe. So this recipe it makes 2 servings, and as you can see, it is healthy carbs, high in fiber, and low sodium. So because it has that low sodium, it'll be good for um, people with higher blood pressure. And this is from Mayo Clinic's recipes. They have a whole bunch of recipes that are low in sodium and they have these labels, so they're good for a bunch of different conditions. So this recipe uses 1.5 cups of uncooked whole grain penne pasta. So we use whole grain because it's higher in fiber. And it also has protein in it because the grain is intact and it has all the components of it rather than just the one part of the grain that contains only carbs. Then we have a cup of asparagus cut into 1-inch pieces, 6 ounces of chicken breast cut into 1-inch cubes. And again, this one talks about skinless chicken breast, and that reduces the fat in the chicken. 2 cloves of minced garlic. This is one of the ways you'd be adding flavor without adding salt. So garlic is something that's really great for that. 1 can of diced tomatoes that does not have any added salt, and you want to include the juice. So this is one of those cases where you'd want to buy the can that says no added salt or low sodium because you're going to be using the juice in that can. And then next we have 2 teaspoons of dried basil or oregano. I'm going to be using basil. And again, just like the garlic, this is one of those ways you'd be adding some flavor without adding the sodium. And then we have 2 different cheeses. So we have soft goat cheese and Parmesan cheese. So with these, it's really important not to use too much because of a couple of reasons. 1, cheese can be high in fat, and 2, it can also be high in sodium. And with the goat cheese, you can substitute that with feta. They both have that kind of tangy flavor. Or you can opt not to have cheese. I love adapting recipes, so I just like to have some in my wheelhouse and kind of adapt them to whatever I want. So with this, we're going to be cooking the pasta for 10 to 12 minutes, drain it, set aside in a pot with a steamer basket, steam the asparagus and cook for a couple minutes. Cook the chicken with garlic over medium-high heat. Cook until the chicken is golden brown. Then add the tomatoes, basil, and simmer that. Then we're going to toss the pasta, asparagus, chicken, and goat cheese and divide it between 2 plates and top with Parmesan. So that's just an overview of this recipe, and it also includes the nutrition facts. So here, this doesn't look exactly like a normal nutrition facts label, but we have our serving size, our total carbohydrate per serving, and we're going to pay attention to the sodium here. So 140 milligrams of sodium. So we talked about how we want to try to limit ourselves to under 1,500 milligrams per day. So the great thing about this is that's less than 10% of your sodium for one meal. So that's a really great thing to have for one meal because it's so low in sodium. And then we look at the saturated fat, which is low, trace amounts of trans fat, which is great because that means that that's really low. 0 grams of added sugar, amazing. Unsaturated fat is the healthier fats, so that's great having some of that. Pretty high in protein, low in cholesterol. So this recipe is really great for a bunch of reasons. And then we look at the fiber, that's really high in fiber. That's because of those whole grains and also from the asparagus. So we look at this nutrition facts, and this is just really great for anybody with hypertension or people who are just wanting to eat a little bit healthier, have a lower fat, lower sodium, high fiber, higher protein. It's really great. And it has those more complex carbs. So it would also be great for anybody who's watching their blood sugar. So now we're going to get into making that recipe of it. And those are just my references for different things. So now we'll get into making this recipe. All right, so I just tossed on an apron, and here I have all my ingredients set up. My 2 pots and my saucepan. So I'm going to go ahead and get this water boiling for the pasta. And see, I have my whole grain penne, and I have a 1.5 cups of that measured out here in this bowl. And then I have 6 ounces of chicken, all diced and ready to be cooked in a bowl that was in the fridge. And here I have my cup of asparagus cut into 1-inch pieces. I have my minced garlic, 2 cloves, my 2 teaspoons of dried basil. And here I have my can of diced tomatoes. So see how this one says no salt added? They have the same can that doesn't say that, and they are right next to each other in the aisle, and they're the same price. So it's really easy to see. So for instance, this can has only 15 milligrams of sodium per serving. So while that is heating up, I will get started on the asparagus and the chicken. So for the chicken, it says to spray the pan with nonstick spray and then go in with the chicken. And the garlic. So I'm just going to add the garlic in a moment. Because I don't want my garlic to burn, so I'm just going to add it in a moment. So for this, we're just using the nonstick spray instead of using normal oil. And here I'm just boiling my water for pasta, and I'm getting the water going for the asparagus at the same time. So my chicken is starting to cook here, so I'm going to toss in this garlic. And just kind of get that going. So like I said before, the garlic adds just some great flavor without adding any sodium to the dish. So we're just going to cook this until the chicken is golden brown. All right, my chicken is cooking. You can probably hear it. My water is starting to boil, so I'm just gonna toss this in and get that going as well. So just gonna let this all continue to cook. And in the meantime, I'm gonna toss my asparagus in to cook as well. And I'll get back to you when it's time to add the next ingredient. All right, my chicken is cooked through, so I'm going to add these tomatoes. This whole can. And with that, the basil. And then I'm just gonna let this simmer for a minute or two and then take it off the heat and put it in a bowl so it can be tossed with our pasta and our asparagus. And in the meantime, I'm going to remove the asparagus from the heat, and we just have to wait for our pasta to be done. All right, my pasta is al dente, so I'm just gonna turn the heat off, go drain it, and go back over to the counter and kind of mix everything together. So in this bowl, I have my chicken, tomato, asparagus, and pasta. And then I'm just gonna add some crumbled goat cheese to that and stir it all together. And something that I love about these kinds of dishes that make 2 servings is if it's just me eating it, I can throw the other portion in the fridge and just save that for another day, for another meal. But it's also great if you're making it for 2 people. So here it is, all mixed together, and I'm just gonna serve it into this dish. It'd be great if I used a bigger spoon for this. So yeah, just kind of serving it up. And just getting about half of that. And then topping it off with a little bit of Parmesan, not too much. The Parmesan I have, if you have grated Parmesan, that's great. Or shredded Parmesan. And there you go. So, something that I would just love for everybody to reflect on if you're watching this video is thinking about kind of what parts of this meal made it great for hypertension. So there's the whole grain pasta, there's the lean chicken, there's the vegetables, using things like garlic and basil instead of adding salt for flavor, the low sodium tomatoes. So kind of just reflect on that and reflect on the foods that you might normally eat. And I'd love for you to just think about those little changes you might be able to make in some of your dishes. So instead of adding salt, what could you add as a seasoning? Or if you normally cook with canned foods, could you find a low sodium option, or could you rinse them off? Or really just kind of find whatever works for you and see if there's a little tweak that you can make and make it whole grain or lower in sodium or have a little bit of extra vegetable. There's so many different ways to do it, and I think it's great if you can just kind of figure out how to apply these concepts to recipes in your life. So thank you so much, and I hope you try this dish or find another one, or just found something in this dish that you can apply to your favorite recipes. Have a great day.